There is a peculiar stillness that settles over the mind whenever it drifts toward the edges of recorded history, as if something ancient is waiting beneath the quiet. The more one listens, the more it feels like a faint pulse coming from a world that once stood before the waters swept everything away. A distant echo of cities erased, of names dissolved into mud, of whole lineages swallowed by a silence so vast it distorts time itself. And so, before you grow too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if what's unfolding here truly speaks to you. If you're willing, share where you're listening from, and what hour the night has reached where you are. Perhaps in that small exchange, the forgotten world will feel a little closer, as though it too is listening back. It begins not with certainty, but with a question that scholars rarely dwell on for long. Why do so many ancient cultures, separated by continents, climates, and languages, insist that an older world once existed before a cataclysmic flood? Why are these stories so consistent? And why does the archaeological record around Mesopotamia carry scars that seem to whisper for events far older than the neat timelines taught today? The Sumerians, in their brittle clay tablets, did not describe the period before the Great Flood as a mythic fantasy. They catalogued it with an unsettling calmness, placing long-forgotten kings in a lineage that stretches across thousands of years, as though time itself once flowed differently. And yet, modern narratives hurry past this strangeness, treating it as symbolic exaggeration or ritual storytelling, as if the ancients did not know how to separate memory from metaphor. But the more one studies the soil of Iraq, the riverbeds of the Euphrates, and the quiet patterns in Sumerian lists, the less symbolic it all feels. Beneath the tells and dunes lie layers of clay deposited by violent water, thick enough to entomb entire settlements. The city of Shurpak, often mentioned in connection to flood legends, reveals a destruction layer, charred remains sealed beneath a blanket of river mud, as if two catastrophes, not one, crashed down on its people. Some archaeologists date that flood layer to around 2900 BCE. Others argue older sediment beneath hints at earlier upheavals, long before writing appeared. The deeper the spade descends, the more the ground begins to resemble a palimpsest. Histories written over older histories, each trying to erase the one before it. What if the Sumerians were not recalling a single flood, but the last in a chain of devastations that had wiped clean most of what came before? Their own texts speak of cities founded before the flood, naming places like Eridu and Bad Tabira as though they existed in some earlier formatting of the world. Eridu, according to current archaeology, truly is one of the earliest urban centers we know. Yet even its earliest strata suggest a complexity that feels inherited, not invented. As if the people who built its first temple mound were not experimenting with civilization, but restoring something remembered faintly, like a ritual learned from ancestors who did not survive to tell their story. Even the Sumerian language, with its isolate structure and its absence of ancestors in known linguistic families, feels like a fragment carried from a lost shoreline. It appears fully formed, with no clear evolutionary path, almost like a remnant salvage from a previous world. Some scholars propose that earlier cultures in the region may simply be missing from the archaeological record because the rivers shift, the ground buries, and time erases. Others quietly admit that what survived into the written age cannot fully account for the sophistication that suddenly appears around 3300 BCE. Writing, accounting systems, monumental architecture, organized priesthoods, and astronomical knowledge so precise it feels accumulated over spans longer than the brief centuries Sumerian civilization occupied. And then there is the Sumerian king list itself, a text both mesmerizing and unsettling. It presents rulers of impossibly long reigns, stretching into the tens of thousands of years. Mainstream academia interprets these as symbolic numerology or mythic grandeur, but one cannot ignore how similar patterns appear across cultures. Egyptian king lists describing divine and semi-divine rule lasting millennia. Texts in the Indus tradition hinting at cycles before cycles, even biblical genealogies showing humans living hundreds of years in the antediluvian age. It is almost as if these ancient narratives, far from being independent, were shards of a larger, older memory, one fractured but not entirely lost. The deeper question is not whether such lifespans were literal, but why so many civilizations framed pre-flood time as fundamentally different, as though the world's conditions themselves were altered. Changes in Earth's magnetic field, shifts in atmospheric composition, cosmic events shaping climate. These ideas have been explored in scientific research, though never tied directly to ancient memory. Yet, the coincidence remains. An older world described as strange, and a newer world emerging suddenly after catastrophe. What kind of event could erase nearly everything yet leave behind enough survivors to rebuild? What could reset knowledge so thoroughly that early writing feels like a desperate attempt to anchor memory before it slipped away again? One also notices how Sumerian texts often speak with a deliberate coolness about the world before the flood, as though mentioning something too potent or too distant for elaboration. The list of antediluvian cities is short, sparse, unexplained. There are no mythic embellishments, only names and numbers. Such restraint feels intentional, as if the scribes were recording fragments of a history they themselves no longer fully understood. Perhaps what they inherited was already incomplete. Stories carried orally by survivors whose own ancestors had lived through a world-altering crisis. When memory crosses so many centuries, clarity dissolves and only structure remains. The names of kings, the order of cities, the sense that something monumental once stood where any ruins and silence remain. And so, the story of the world before the Great Flood is not one of certainty, but of shadows cast across cracked clay tablets. It lives in the gaps between sediment layers, in the sudden complexity of early Sumer, in the fragmentation of language families whose roots disappear into prehistory. It is the feeling of standing on ground that hides more than it reveals, as though somewhere beneath our feet lies a ghost of an older earth, waiting to be noticed. If the Sumerian records hold even a faint echo of that vanished age, then what exactly did the floodwaters take from humanity? And why does it feel as though the world still remembers what we have forgotten? It is difficult to move forward without returning to the most unsettling feature of those Sumerian tablets, the lifespans. They stretch across the mind like impossible shadows, refusing to fade even when reason insists they should. The moment one reads the Sumerian king list, a quiet tension settles in, not because the text is loud or dramatic, but because it is so calm about the unbelievable. It names kings who ruled for 28,000 years, 36,000, even longer. No embellishment, no poetry, no divine thunder. Just numbers pressed into wet clay, left to dry in the Mesopotamian sun, waiting for someone thousands of years later to confront the unease they carry. For anyone reading them today, the simplest response is to dismiss these spans as symbolic. Many scholars say as much. They argue that ancient scribes encoded spiritual significance, or used base 60 mathematical patterns, or layered myth onto memory. And yet, even within those carefully reasoned explanations, there lingers an uncomfortable detail. Many of these reign lengths follow no tidy pattern. They are not uniform exaggerations. They fluctuate in ways that do not easily map onto number systems or ritual structures. They slip between the symbolic and the unpredictable, as though reflecting something that once felt natural to the people who composed them. The more one studies the earliest Mesopotamian writings, the more one senses an implied divide between the world before the flood and the world after, not merely a chronological break, but a transformation of existence itself. Before the flood, kings rule for thousands of years. After the flood, they rule for decades or centuries. It is not a gradual transition, but a cliff, sudden and absolute. And such a stark contrast appears in other traditions as well. Ancient Egyptian dynastic lists, biblical genealogies, Vedic cycles. Everywhere, lifespans seem to collapse after a catastrophic dividing line, like a candle flame suddenly deprived of oxygen. What could make so many distant cultures display the same pattern? Scholars offer natural explanations: changes in environmental conditions, population pressures, disease dynamics, or shifts in symbolic storytelling. Yet none fully address the strange consistency of the motif. Some researchers have explored the possibility that ancient peoples, living closer to the end of the last ice age, might have experienced environmental conditions different from those of the present. Earth's magnetic field has fluctuated dramatically. Cosmic radiation levels have shifted. The planet's atmosphere has undergone transitions that altered biological processes in ways still not entirely understood. These scientific explorations are cautious, but they reveal a simple truth: the world has not always been as it is now. The king list sits at the center of these uncertainties like a quiet witness. It does not attempt to justify or explain its numbers. It presents them with the same matter-of-fact tone used to record grain shipments, temple inventories, or property boundaries. This lack of embellishment is what makes it so difficult to ignore. If the lifespans were meant to be symbolic, why not say so? Why not frame them in mythic language as the Greeks and Norse did? Why treat impossibility as though it were administrative data? Some scholars have proposed that the numbers might encode something other than chronological time. Perhaps the long reigns signify dynastic eras compressed into single names. Perhaps they reflect astronomical cycles, such as precessional ages or lunar counts. And yet these theories, while elegant, risk imposing modern frameworks upon ancient minds. The Sumerians were meticulous record keepers, but they did not shy away from cosmological thinking. To them, time was not a straight line, but an interplay of cycles, rhythms, and divine patterns. A king ruling for thousands of years might have represented a lineage maintained under a single symbolic figure. Or it might have reflected a memory so old that its original meaning had already faded when the tablets were written. One cannot overlook the archaeological context either. The earliest settled communities of southern Mesopotamia show an abrupt transition from simple village life to sophisticated urban organization. Clay tokens become complex administrative tablets almost overnight. Architectural forms leap from huts to temple complexes. Agricultural systems bloom with a coordination that seems inherited rather than discovered. It is as if the first generations after the flood, or after some major upheaval, were rebuilding from fragments rather than constructing from scratch. If that is the case, then the long lifespans in the king list may be echoes of a time when history was not measured as cleanly as it would be later. There is also the haunting possibility that the numbers memorialize a world with different biological conditions, one in which lifespans truly were longer. Not thousands of years perhaps, but significantly more than the few decades typical of early agricultural societies. Certain environmental theories propose that pre-Holocene atmospheric composition may have influenced aging processes. Others point to genetic bottlenecks following major catastrophes that altered the health and longevity of surviving populations. These ideas do not prove anything, but they widen the lens through which ancient texts can be viewed, allowing space for memory to be neither literal nor purely symbolic. What is striking is how consistently the post-flood world is described as diminished. In the king list, the tone shifts after the flood. Reign lengths shrink, cities multiply, and the age of heroes disappears. It feels like a world awakening after a long sleep, disoriented, piecing together what remains. Similar moods appear in other traditions. The biblical narrative speaks of a decline in human lifespan. Greek texts describe the fading of the golden age into lesser ages. Hindu literature outlines yugas that degrade over time. The Sumerians, however, are unique in how quietly they bury this transition beneath administrative language. They do not mourn the loss, they simply record it. And perhaps that is what makes their tablets so compelling. They were not trying to persuade anyone. They were not crafting epic poetry or philosophical allegories. They were listing rulers and cities. And yet, within that simple framework, they preserved something that feels older than writing itself. A memory of a time when the rhythm of life, the shape of time, and the very conditions of being human were different. Whether that difference was biological, environmental, cultural, or metaphysical, remains impossible to know. But the persistence of the motif across civilizations raises a quiet question, one that resists resolution. If so many traditions recall a world where lifespans stretched far beyond what we know today, what exactly changed when the waters receded? And why does every ancient record seem to agree that something essential was lost? There is a moment when, staring at a map of ancient Mesopotamia, where the mind begins to drift toward the ground itself. Not the cities, not the rulers, not even the tablets, but the soil layered beneath them. And in that quiet shift of attention, an unsettling truth rises. The earth remembers things humans have forgotten. Long before scribes pressed signs into clay, before kings claimed thrones or priests traced the movements of stars, the land carried the imprint of something violent. It endures still, silent yet stubborn, a geological scar preserved under thousands of years of dust and civilization. And once one notices it, the story of the Great Flood becomes far more than myth. Archaeologists digging at Shurapak discovered something that resisted easy explanation. A layer of river silt unlike what should have appeared naturally. Not a gentle deposit from yearly flooding, but a thick band of mud, more than a meter in some areas, overlaying burnt ruins, burned wood, charred grain, collapsed walls frozen in place. Then the mud. It was as though one catastrophe had been cut abruptly by another. Fire followed by water, destruction piled upon destruction. Above that mud, signs of life cautiously return. New pottery styles, new dwellings, new names. A reset, a beginning again. Radiocarbon samples suggest this layer formed around 2900 BCE. A date some scholars have proposed corresponds with the severe regional flood mentioned in late Mesopotamian texts. But then comes the deeper problem. Similar layers, scattered across other ancient sites, bear witness to earlier pulses of water-driven devastation. The sediment beds do not appear uniform in age, and in some places they lie beneath levels far older than any textual record. This inconsistency unsettles the narrative. It whispers of multiple events, not one. Multiple collapses, multiple resets. If that is true, then the Sumerian story of a single great flood might be a memory compressed from a series of catastrophes, the final, most devastating one simply overshadowing the rest. Geologists studying the end of the last ice age often speak of meltwater pulses, sudden surges of fresh water released when massive glacial structures collapsed. Meltwater pulse 1b, for example, around 11,500 years ago, raised global sea levels dramatically in a short period. Though its effects were global, the rapid rise would have been experienced most violently in low-lying coastal regions, including the shallow marine shelves that once connected parts of the Persian Gulf. Those shelves now drowned, buried beneath thick layers of silt. Theoretically, what is now the floor of the Gulf may once have been fertile land, a landscape erased, sealed underwater with no record except the stories of the survivors who fled to higher ground. Some researchers have proposed that the earliest Mesopotamian settlements may have been founded by people displaced from these drowned regions. The chronology is far from certain, but the persistence of the flood motif hints that memories of such submergence may have survived for generations. Humans carry memories not only through writing, but through ritual, myth, and inherited fear. A sudden rise of water sweeping away communities would etch itself into cultural consciousness in ways far deeper than the tablets that came later. Yet there is more than rising seas. Some scientists studying the Younger Dryas period, around 12 to 800 years ago, suggest that a fragmented comet or meteoritic event could have triggered sudden climatic shifts. Evidence for this remains controversial. Peaks of platinum in ice cores, microspherules found across multiple continents, signs of intense wildfires. If such an event occurred, it might have deeply destabilized early human populations. In that scenario, the flood theme across world mythologies may reflect not only water, but the broader chaos that followed. Fires, cold, famine, displacement. A world collapsing into survival mode, preserving fragments of memory that later civilizations attempted to interpret. Against this background, the geological scar at Shurapak feels less like an isolated natural disaster, and more like a local echo of older, larger cycles. While the mud layer at that site marks a date thousands of years after any hypothesized global event, the pattern of destruction and renewal remains consistent. A settlement rises, thrives, collapses. Another rises in its place. The layers of earth become a record not just of habitation but of forgetting. And this forgetting is important. For in the Sumerian king list, the world before the flood is described with a brevity that suggests distance, a minimalism of memory. Names listed, cities named, nothing more. No details of how these antediluvian societies lived, what technologies they possessed, what rituals they practiced. The silence feels less like mythic reverence and more like the quiet that follows trauma. The kind in which meaning itself is fractured, and only the outline of what happened can be carried forward. The geological record, however, speaks without hesitation. At sites along ancient riverbeds, researchers find alternating layers of habitation and destruction. Ur, Kish, Lagash, and other early cities all display traces of sudden environmental shifts. Some layers show signs of massive flooding, others reveal drought and abandonment. Climate oscillations during the mid-Holocene were more extreme than once believed, and each swing between wet and dry reshaped human settlement patterns. When seen through this lens, the biblical and Mesopotamian flood stories may be cultural compressions of long sequences of environmental upheavals, woven together into a single narrative by later scribes. But there remains the inconvenient fact that the great flood myths around the world, from Mesopotamia to India, China, the Americas, and the Mediterranean, share not only broad themes but specific details: a righteous survivor, a vessel, warnings from divine or semi-divine figures, a world cleansed, a new humanity arising afterward. Such similarities challenge the idea of purely local flood events. They imply either shared ancestral memory or parallel experiences so severe that they left identical scars on cultures continents apart. And so the geological scar beneath Shurapak becomes more than a layer of mud. It becomes a metaphor for a deeper wound in human history, one still visible but only partially understood. The land remembers what people lost, settlements swallowed, lineages broken, languages forgotten before they could be written. Perhaps the Sumerians, in recording the Great Flood, were attempting to preserve not a single event but the memory of a world repeatedly undone. The question that lingers is whether the flood remembered in their tablets was truly the final one, or simply the last one survivors managed to describe. If earlier worlds existed and were washed away, their ruins may lie not only beneath Mesopotamian soil, but beneath seas, deserts, and mountains shaped by time's relentless hand. And if the ground beneath us still carries those traces, what else might be waiting in the unexplored layers, silent yet undeniable? There are places where history feels unusually thin, where the ground seems to hold its breath as though guarding something too immense to reveal all at once. Shurapak is one of those places. At first glance, it is little more than a mound of earth in southern Iraq, a dusty rise shaped by millennia of wind and abandonment. But beneath its quiet surface lies a riddle that has unsettled archaeologists for over a century. A riddle not of one catastrophe, but of two, layered like twin shadows over the same land. When one kneels beside the trenches where ancient bricks emerge from the earth, it becomes clear that this city did not simply fall. It was erased, rebuilt, and erased again. The earliest excavations at Shurapak revealed a burn layer so violent and sudden that scholars initially believed the city had been destroyed by invading forces. Charcoal, shattered grain jars, collapsed walls, the signs of fire were unmistakable. Yet something felt wrong. The destruction was too complete, too immediate, too silent. No weapons, no bodies, no signs of siege. Just the remains of a city stopped mid-breath, as though something had struck without warning. And then, above that charcoal, came the mud, a thick band of river silt sealing the ruins, smoothing their jagged edges into a quiet tomb. Fire then water, two endings stacked one atop the other. For decades, researchers debated whether this layering aligned with the famous flood described in Sumerian tradition. The Epic of Ziusudra, predecessor to the Akkadian Atrahasis, and later the story of Noah, places Shurapak at the center of the antediluvian world. It is the city where the gods, uneasy with humanity's growing noise, choose one man to survive the coming deluge. The connection between myth and mud seemed poetic but uncertain. Archaeology demands more than resemblance. And yet, the sediment at Shurapak refused to conform to ordinary explanations. Unlike seasonal flooding, which leaves thin, predictable deposits, this layer was thick, homogeneous, and strangely sterile. No seeds, no roots, no gradual accumulation. It appeared to have arrived in a single overwhelming surge, sweeping across the city and burying its burned skeleton in silence. Even more troubling was its extent. Similar deposits were found at Kish and other early sites, forming a regional tapestry of sudden inundation. Not a local river flood, but something broader, something that altered the landscape so abruptly that rebuilding began as if on fresh ground. When the burn layer beneath this mud was studied more closely, archaeologists realized it did not match the pottery or urban patterns of the layers above. The people who rebuilt Shurapak were not the same as those who lived there before. Their tools were different, their homes were arranged differently, their ceramics bore unfamiliar motifs. It was as though the city had been inherited by strangers, survivors perhaps from elsewhere, drawn to the abandoned mound once the waters withdrew. If this interpretation is true, it aligns eerily with the Sumerian narrative. A world reset, its previous inhabitants gone, replaced by those who emerged after catastrophe. But the strangeness deepens. Beneath the burn layer, archaeologists found hints of earlier settlement, signs that Shurapak had risen before, flourished and fallen under circumstances unrelated to fire or flood. Pottery styles from these deeper levels do not flourish upward. They end abruptly. The soil composition shifts as though interrupted. Something had happened long before the famous mud layer, something that archaeology has not yet identified. This is why some researchers refer to Shuruppak as the city that drowned twice, though the second drowning, the deeper one, is still only a shadow in the earth. Clay tablets recovered from the site during the Pharaoh period add another layer of mystery. They contain lists of goods, hymns to gods, calculations of grain distribution, and even proverbs. Yet what is most haunting is the absence of reference to the city's earlier lives. The scribes of Shuruppak recorded the world around them in meticulous detail, yet they offered no memory of the disaster sealed beneath their feet. No mention of fire, no mention of a flood that had buried a previous generation. It is as if the people who lived there after the catastrophe had forgotten, or perhaps they never knew. One tablet in particular, often called the Instructions of Shuruppak, is considered one of the oldest literary works we possess. It offers moral advice, warnings, observations about human nature. A father speaking to a son. But even here, in a text so intimate and reflective, there is nothing about the fire or the flood that reshaped the city. Nothing about the world before. Could it be that this silence reflects the trauma of a population that arrived afterward, their own past severed from the land they rebuilt? Or does it reflect a deeper truth, that much older memories had already been lost, buried beneath layers too ancient for scribes to comprehend? Some archaeologists propose that the older destruction layers at Shuruppak might correlate with environmental instability at the end of the Ubaid period. Others point to fluctuations in the Euphrates Channel, suggesting the river itself may have shifted violently, swallowing parts of settlements. Still others wonder whether smaller, localized catastrophes were later woven into a single mythic event by emerging priestly elites. Yet even these cautious explanations acknowledge a fundamental reality. Shuruppak carries scars that history did not fully record. When seen in the wider Mesopotamian context, the patterns become more unsettling. Uruk shows evidence of sudden abandonment. Eridu contains ritual structures built atop older ones with no clay continuity. Early Kish displays breaks in habitation that suggest periods of population collapse. None of these disruptions align neatly in time, yet they share the same quality: abruptness. The world of early civilization was not stable. It rose quickly, faltered, rose again, and through each cycle memory thinned. The Sumerians, in their myths of antediluvian kings and catastrophic floods, may have attempted to compress these cycles into a single narrative stream. A world before, a world after, a boundary of water in between. If so, then Shuruppak is the physical reminder of what that boundary feels like. It is the place where fire ended one world and water buried it before the next had begun, and the silence of its later inhabitants may speak to something larger, the way civilizations inherit the ruins of those before them, without understanding what truly came to pass. As the trenches at Shuruppak continue to reveal more questions than answers, one cannot help but wonder, if this city drowned twice, how many other cities, older and deeper, lie hidden beneath riverbeds, deserts, and seas, waiting to rewrite the story of humanity's forgotten ages? There is a subtle tension that arises whenever early writing is discussed. A quiet contradiction at the very foundation of recorded history. It is this: writing appears not as a slow evolution, but as a sudden arrival. Script does not gently unfold from crude markings into sophisticated systems over long centuries. Instead, fully formed writing systems emerge abruptly in several regions of the ancient world, as though memory itself had been transferred rather than invented. And nowhere is this more apparent than in the earliest Sumerian tablets, which seem to speak from a world already familiar with the logic of writing long before the first sign was ever pressed into clay. The oldest cuneiform tablets, discovered in places like Uruk and Kish, do not look like hesitant beginnings. They show accounting systems, administrative records, and complex ideograms. Even their earliest phases reveal mathematical proficiency, with sexagesimal number systems already present, implying a depth of conceptual understanding that should have required centuries to mature. Yet the archaeological layers beneath these tablets offer little evidence of transitional stages. There is no long experiment with proto-writing, no messy progression from pictographs carved on bone or stone. Instead, cuneiform seems to step into history almost fully clothed. The puzzle deepens when one studies the Kish tablet, often cited as one of the oldest examples of writing ever found. It displays markings that look like a bridge between proto-symbols and true script, yet its style is strangely refined for its supposed antiquity. Other tablets from the Emdet Nasr period show similar anomalies. Their signs are highly standardized, suggesting a system that had already been in use elsewhere, or earlier, before appearing in the archaeological record. This abruptness is not unique to Mesopotamia. The earliest Egyptian hieroglyphs appearing around the same period show no clear developmental sequence. They too appear complete. Their symbolism is already rich, their grammar functional, their conventions standardized. Scholars have long debated whether Sumer influenced Egypt or vice versa, or whether both emerged independently. But each explanation carries its own contradiction. Independent invention seems improbable, given the simultaneous complexity. Cultural borrowing seems equally unlikely given the absence of transitional stages in either region. It is as though both civilizations inherited a fragmented memory, something older than writing itself, and then expressed it in different ways. Some researchers point to the Tartaria tablets discovered in Romania, whose signs resemble early Sumerian motifs, yet date to a period seemingly too early for direct connection. Others draw attention to the enigmatic symbols found at Göbekli Tepe, which predate agriculture and settled life, suggesting a tradition of symbolic communication far older than previously assumed. While none of these artifacts constitute writing in the strict academic sense, they challenge the assumption that proto-scripts evolved only in the late Neolithic. They hint at a deeper tradition of encoded knowledge, lost or transformed during the upheavals that marked the transition from the late Pleistocene to the Holocene. Into this puzzle enters the Sumerian king list, a document that feels too old for its own writing system. The list contains information about antediluvian rulers, cities, and reign lengths that feel displaced from ordinary historical context. The question becomes unavoidable. Were these memories already ancient by the time writing was invented? If so, how were they preserved? Oral tradition, ritual recitation, fragments of an earlier symbolic system no longer recognizable? Or were they copied from older materials that did not survive the flood layers now sealing their absence? To understand this tension, one must consider how societies emerging from trauma-store memory. When catastrophic events interrupt cultural continuity, writing systems can be lost, preserved only in vestigial form, then rediscovered or reinvented by descendants who no longer fully understand their original structure. The earliest cuneiform could represent a reconstruction, an attempt to capture remnants of older knowledge using new symbols shaped by a changed world. In this view, the missing stages of writing are not missing because they never existed, but because they belong to a civilizational culture erased by environmental catastrophe. The clay tablets we possess would then represent the survivors' attempt to salvage what they could. This interpretation becomes more compelling when one examines the content of early tablets. They often record standardized lists, commodities, professions, gods, cities. It is as though the scribes were trying to re-establish order, to anchor memory in tangible form before it slipped away. Lists of the tools of reconstruction. They appear when societies are reorganizing after trauma. They reflect the need to categorize what has survived and what remains to be rebuilt. They are not the marks of the beginning, but the signs of a world returning to equilibrium. If writing was indeed a restoration rather than an invention, it would explain why the earliest tablets seem strangely confident. It would also clarify why certain myths appear so fully formed. The flood narrative, the genealogy of kings, the structure of divine councils, such stories may have been inherited from a pre-flood world, not in linguistic form but in the collective psyche. And when scribes finally pressed these memories onto clay, they did so using a script that carried echoes of an older, lost system. Scholars caution against speculation, yet they also acknowledge that the earliest phases of writing remain poorly understood. Excavations at Uruk reveal a startling increase in complexity over only a few generations. Symbolic abstraction appears suddenly. Numeric precision jumps abruptly. Administrative sophistication emerges almost overnight. These patterns do not align neatly with slow cultural evolution. Instead, they resemble rapid recovery, the rebound of a society rebuilding from fragments. The silence beneath these tablets is also telling. Beneath the layers where writing appears, older strata often show sophisticated architecture, coordinated settlements, and organized trade networks. These societies did not live in ignorance. Their disappearance from textual history may reflect not a lack of knowledge but a lack of written preservation. When the flood layers came, when fire swept cities, when droughts emptied river channels, whatever writing existed before may have perished with the structures that held it. And so we return to the tablet problem. Texts that feel older than their script. Writing that appears too mature for its archaeological context. Memories that seem displaced, belonging to an age that even the earliest scribes approached with reverence and uncertainty. If the first written records of humanity already refer to a world before the flood, then what does that imply about the unwritten records, the ones washed away, or buried deep beneath layers of earth and water? If the earliest scripts are merely the echo of a lost system, then what fragments of the pre-flood world might still lie hidden, encoded in symbols that modern eyes have not yet learned to read? There is a peculiar kind of silence that rests over the names of the antediluvian cities. They appear in the Sumerian king list as though carved from the bedrock of a forgotten age, each mentioned with the same cold brevity that characterizes the entire pre-flood section. Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippa, Shuruppak. No descriptions, no myths, no explanations. They are named the way one might list mountains, fixed, immovable, assumed to be known. And yet, when archaeologists kneel over the dust where these cities once stood, the ground offers a story far more fragmented and elusive than the tablets imply. Take Eridu, often called the oldest city in Mesopotamia, and by some, the oldest city in the world. Its earliest levels date to the Ubaid period, long before writing, long before the structured city-states that would come to define early civilization. But what makes Eridu unsettling is not its age, but its consistency. For thousands of years, the same sacred mound was rebuilt again and again, layer upon layer, forming a sequence of temple platforms rising like geological strata of human devotion. The earliest levels show no sign of primitive beginnings. The architecture is organized, ritualized, coherent. It feels inherited, as if the people who built those first temples did so following blueprints older than their settlement, on the marshy edge of the Persian Gulf. If the Sumerian king list is to be taken even partially as memory rather than myth, then Eridu's role as the first city after kingship descended from heaven becomes more complicated. Perhaps the phrase reflects not divine intervention, but a transition, a re-establishment of order after catastrophe. Kingship descending might mean restoring an older system, not creating a new one. Eridu then would not be the birthplace of civilization, but the first beacon rekindled after the extinguishing of a previous world. Bad Tabira, the second city on the list, offers even less clarity. Its exact location remains debated. The archaeological site believed to correspond to it, modern Tel al-Medain, has revealed structures and pottery from the early Bronze Age, but nothing that clearly distinguishes it as extraordinarily old. And yet the king list places Bad Tabira firmly in the pre-flood sequence. It assigns it rulers whose reigns span tens of thousands of years. How does one reconcile these textual claims with the sparse material remains? One answer is that the city named in the tablets may represent a lineage rather than a single site, a tradition or cultural center whose earlier forms have vanished beneath layers of silt, shifting rivers, and millennia of erosion. If Bad Tabira existed before the flood, its earliest ruins may lie underwater in regions once part of the ancient coastline. Larak, a third antediluvian city, remains unidentified entirely. No archaeological site has been conclusively matched to its name. It exists only on clay tablets, a ghost city floating in textual memory. This absence is not unusual for early Mesopotamia. Rivers have shifted dramatically since the late Pleistocene, burying settlements or washing them into the Gulf. Yet Larak's disappearance feels symbolic, a reminder that whole chapters of early human settlement may lie beyond our reach. If a city could vanish so completely, how much more might have been erased by the violent events recorded in flood legends? Sippar, the fourth city, is better known. Excavations at Tel Abu Hubba have uncovered archives of tablets from the Old Babylonian period, along with temple complexes dedicated to the sun god Shamash. But beneath these layers lie traces of earlier settlement. Not enough to reconstruct a detailed history, but enough to indicate that Sippar's origins stretch far back into the late Neolithic. The king list placement of Sippar in the pre-flood world suggests that the city was not merely ancient but foundational. Its role as the home of a solar deity, associated with order and cosmic oversight, may hint at a deeper memory, the revival of astronomical knowledge after a long period of disruption. Shuruppak, the fifth and final city before the flood, we have already explored. The city that drowned twice. The city whose silence reveals the fragility of memory. Its inclusion on the list marks it as the last keeper of antediluvian kingship, the final link in a chain that snapped when the waters rose. What makes the sequence striking is not just the cities themselves, but the implication that there were only five centers of order, 5 pillars of a world now lost. After the flood, kingship does not return to any of these places. Instead, it is taken to Kish, marking a break in continuity. This shift raises questions. Why did none of the pre-flood cities regain their former role? Why did kingship not return to Eridu, a supposed first city of the world? Did these sites lose their significance because they were destroyed too thoroughly? Or because the survivors who rebuilt civilization were no longer connected to them culturally or linguistically? The silence of the tablets suggests rupture, a discontinuity so deep that the centers of power themselves were redefined. Archaeologically, this discontinuity is mirrored in the settlement patterns of the early 3rd millennium BCE. After the flood layers, new cities emerge with different organizational structures. Pottery styles shift abruptly. Religious iconography changes. New languages and administrative systems appear. Even the mythological landscape transforms. The gods of earlier periods recede, replaced or reinterpreted by new pantheons. These rapid cultural transitions suggest that the people rebuilding the land after the catastrophe were not simply descendants of those who lived before, but a mixture of incoming groups and surviving remnants. In this sense, the antediluvian cities may represent not physical places alone but cultural identities erased or transformed by environmental disaster. Some researchers have proposed that the pre-flood cities in the King List could correspond to settlement centers from the late Ubaid and early Uruk periods, which were disrupted by major climatic fluctuations. Others argue that they may encode memories of even older sites now buried under the Persian Gulf, where sea levels rose dramatically after the Ice Age. If those submerged regions once housed complex communities, their erasure would leave only faint echoes, city names without ruins, stories without structures. The deeper one looks, the more the antediluvian cities resemble anchors for memories that could not be fully preserved. Names like Eridu and Sippar become reference points for cultural identity, while names like Larak slip into the realm of shadows, and perhaps that is the point. The Sumerians were not offering a catalogue of archaeology, they were offering a genealogy of order, a sequence of centers that upheld the structure of the world before it collapsed. If these cities truly existed before the flood, in whatever form that era took, then their ruins, or their ancestors, may still lie hidden beneath layers of earth and water. And if their names survived while their histories vanished, what does that say about the worlds buried deeper still, the ones whose names did not even endure the long silence that followed the rising waters? There is a strange quiet that settles over ancient Mesopotamian astronomy, a quiet not of ignorance, but of precision. It is the kind of precision that feels out of place in the early Bronze Age, where most of humanity still lived in simple agrarian communities, guided by superstition and survival rather than calculation. And yet, the earliest tablets from Sumer contain numbers, cycles, and observations that should have taken centuries, even millennia, to refine. They seem to speak from a vantage point already familiar with the sky, long before cities rose, long before scribes learned to bake clay. The question that lingers beneath these details is not whether the Sumerians were clever, they undoubtedly were, but how they knew what they knew as early as they did. Cuneiform tablets from the Old Babylonian period record the synodic cycles of Venus with astonishing accuracy. The best-known example, the so-called Venus tablet of Amisa Duca, details a series of observations that align closely with modern astronomical calculations. This would be remarkable enough on its own, but the tablet likely reflects knowledge already ancient by the time it was written. Its highly organized structure suggests that the scribes who copied it were drawing from a much older tradition of skywatching, one that preceded their own dynasties, and possibly even the invention of writing. This is where the puzzle deepens. If the earliest written records already show advanced astronomy, then the knowledge must have been preserved orally or symbolically long before tablets existed. But how long before, and in what form? Some scholars propose generational observation. Families of priests parsing down methods and rules, refining them slowly. Others suggest a more formalized pre-writing system, perhaps encoded in ritual or architecture. Yet there remains a lingering oddity. True astronomical precision does not evolve in incremental steps. It requires lengthy baselines of observation spanning many centuries. What appears on the tablets implies not just curiosity but sustained and systematic recording over long periods of time. The Sumerians were acutely aware of celestial cycles, the paths of the planets, the rising of certain stars, the rhythm of eclipses, and the slow, almost imperceptible drift of the heavens. Their identification of the zodiac, their use of a 360-degree circle, their base 60 numerical system, all reveal a sophistication that seems rooted in deep time. Some researchers argue that the structure of their astronomical system reflects an inherited framework, not an invented one. They did not discover these cycles, they inherited them. From whom, or from when, remains unanswered. The idea of inheritance gains weight when one considers the architectural alignments of early Mesopotamian temples. The ziggurat of Enki at Eridu, among the oldest ritual structures we know, shows signs of alignment to celestial events, not perfect, but intentional. Later ziggurats become more precise, suggesting a tradition of sky-oriented construction that predates the written record. This raises the possibility that the earliest temple builders were not simply constructing places of worship, but re-establishing older patterns of cosmological symbolism. They built as though following instructions remembered dimly, like recreating a melody without knowing its original composer. The comparison with other ancient cultures is inevitable. Egyptian temples align with solstices and star risings. The Indus Valley civilization possessed mathematical and astronomical knowledge, visible in its urban planning. Even the Maya, thousands of years later in a distant hemisphere, charted celestial cycles with uncanny accuracy. These parallels have led some scholars to argue for convergence, that early civilizations naturally developed astronomical systems because they needed them for agriculture and ritual, and yet, this explanation feels too neat. The level of precision recorded in the earliest Mesopotamian documents does not resemble a beginning. It resembles continuity. The Sumerians themselves hint at this continuity in their myths. In their stories of the seven sages Ap-Kalu, they describe ancient beings who brought knowledge of civilization to humanity after a great catastrophe. These sages, part divine and part mortal, are said to have taught early humans the arts of writing, agriculture, building, and the ordering of the heavens. Scholars interpret these stories symbolically, as literary expressions of cultural memory. But the motif is striking. Knowledge coming from an earlier age, delivered to survivors of a disrupted world. A world that may have been the antediluvian era the King List references so briefly. Of course, myth alone cannot explain the astronomical anomalies, but it does gesture toward a psychological truth. The early Sumerians believed their knowledge came from long before their own time. They did not see themselves as inventors, but as inheritors. Their role was to preserve and restore, not initiate. The fragments of earlier worlds surrounded them, in the ruined mounds, in the eroded foundations beneath their temples, in the memory of floods that had swept away everything familiar. The astronomical records, therefore, may reflect a cultural compulsion to reconstruct the order of the sky, as it had been known before the catastrophe. Another dimension of the puzzle lies in their numerical system. Base 60 mathematics is elegant, flexible, and incredibly powerful for astronomy. It allows simple expression of fractions and cycles, but its origin remains unclear. No evolutionary pathway explains why the Sumerians developed such a system so early, or why it became the backbone of their cosmological calculations. If Base 60 emerged from earlier traditions now lost to time, then the entire astronomical framework we associate with early Mesopotamia may represent only the remnants of something older. Some researchers point to the possibility of long-term skywatching traditions rooted in late Paleolithic or early Neolithic communities. Sites like Göbekli Tepe, although not Mesopotamian, show astronomical symbolism long before agriculture. Carvings hint at star patterns, seasonal markers, and ritual observances tied to celestial events. If early humans were already tracking the sky with such intention, then it is not impossible that long-term observational frameworks survived into later civilizations through oral or symbolic transmission. But even this explanation does not account fully for the Sumerian precision regarding planetary cycles. Venus's movements, for example, require extremely long observational baselines to chart reliably. The fact that early tablets record these cycles so accurately suggests either an unbroken tradition, improbable given the flood layers and settlement disruptions, or a restoration from retained fragments of older knowledge. This is where the idea of a geological and cultural reset intersects with the puzzle of astronomy. If a major catastrophe disrupted early societies, wiping out settlements and scattering populations, then much knowledge would have been lost. But fragments of astronomical understanding, encoded in ritual, symbol, or memory, could have been passed down to survivors who later transformed them into the structured systems we now see in the tablets. In this view, early Mesopotamian astronomy becomes the echo of an older science, one dimmed by disaster but not extinguished. The deeper one looks into Sumerian celestial records, the more the boundaries of history begin to blur. Their knowledge feels both ancient and reassembled, inherited and reinterpreted. If the sky once served as humanity's oldest library, then the flood, or whatever sequence of catastrophes inspired that legend, may have washed away most of its pages, leaving only the fragments that the earliest scribes worked so carefully to preserve. If those early astronomers truly carried the last embers of a pre-flood understanding of the heavens, then what earlier patterns might have guided their eyes? Patterns still waiting in the darkness of forgotten time, unobserved yet unchanged in the silent turning of the stars. There is a certain unease that arises whenever an artifact emerges from the ground, looking as though it belongs to a world slightly misaligned with the one archaeology describes. These objects are not dramatic enough to rewrite history outright. They are small, humble, often ambiguous. Yet each one tugs at the edges of the accepted timeline, like loose threads hinting at a deeper pattern beneath the surface. They're not proof of anything extraordinary on their own, but together they create a quiet tension. A sense that the story we tell about early civilization may be missing a chapter or two. In the museums of Baghdad and Istanbul, in storms across Europe, and in private collections whose origins blur across time, one finds items that resist simple explanation. Some belong to the Ubaid period, others to the early Uruk or Jemdet Nasr phases. Their styles do not fit neatly within the artistic or technological sequences that scholars expect. The most famous among them are the Ubaid figurines, small statues with elongated heads, large almond-shaped eyes, and bodies that blend human and reptilian attributes. Scholars typically interpret them as stylized deities or mythic beings. But their appearance remains unsettling, especially because they predate the elaborate anthropomorphic gods of later Mesopotamian religion. Why would one of the earliest artistic traditions depict figures so unlike humans? What memory or symbol were these early sculptors trying to preserve? Then there is the so-called Baghdad battery, an object far younger than the Ubaid artifacts but equally contentious. A simple clay vessel containing a copper cylinder and iron rod. It appears capable of generating a weak electric charge when filled with acidic liquid. Though many researchers dismiss it as a ritual container or a storage vessel, the fact remains that its components resemble an elementary galvanic cell. If this was accidental, it is an extraordinary coincidence. If intentional, it implies an experimental curiosity unfamiliar to the conventional technological arc of the ancient world. Even more intriguing is that the artifact was discovered in a region rich with earlier, more enigmatic traditions that may have carried fragments of lost knowledge into later eras. Other items raise different questions. Stone bowls and vases from Uruk levels show machining patterns that appear too regular for hand tools, though such interpretations are often debated. Certain early cylinder seals display astronomical motifs that do not align perfectly with the sky of their era. And in deeper layers one finds serpentine motifs, spirals, and geometric patterns that appear across distant cultures, as though tapping into a symbolic vocabulary older than the civilizations that use them. None of these items confirm anything dramatic on their own, but they collectively challenge the idea that early Mesopotamia developed in a linear, isolated fashion. Part of the problem lies in the gaps, periods where the archaeological record thins, where layers of settlement disappear suddenly or show signs of abrupt cultural transformation. These gaps create space for ambiguity, for the possibility that earlier traditions influence later craftsmanship. If a flood or a series of catastrophes erased large portions of a culture's material history, survivors might inherit fragments of unfamiliar tools, motifs, or techniques without fully understanding their origins. When these fragments reappear in later contexts, they look like anomalies rather than remnants of something older. The Ubaid reptilian figurines, for example, have no clear descendants in later Mesopotamian art. They do not evolve into anything. They do not merge with later iconography. They simply vanish. This absence suggests either that they belong to a symbolic system swept away by environmental or social upheaval, or that their meaning became taboo or obsolete in the rebuilding periods that followed. Their abrupt disappearance parallels the sudden stops found in pottery lines, architectural styles, and settlement patterns, as though certain cultural threads were cut cleanly, never to be rejoined. Another category of anomalous artifacts includes early metallurgical items that appear too sophisticated for their context. Some copper alloys found in late Ubaid or early Uruk layers show signs of deliberate compositional control. The precision suggests knowledge of how different metal mixtures behave, a knowledge typically associated with later periods. Yet these early metallurgists seem to have mastered certain techniques without leaving behind the usual experimental debris. This is strange. Technological development usually leaves a trail of failures, half-formed attempts, discarded prototypes. But here, with these alloys, the record is silent. Either the experimental phase occurred somewhere else, perhaps in older or now lost settlements, or the knowledge was not newly discovered at all. The serpent motifs found across early Mesopotamia deepen the puzzle further. Snakes appear everywhere, in pottery, in figurines, in temple reliefs. Some researchers link these images to fertility or water symbolism. Others see them as remnants of older mythologies tied to regeneration and wisdom. But the prevalence and consistency of the motif hint at something more universal, perhaps an inherited memory from deep prehistory. The serpent as a symbol predates agriculture. It appears in Paleolithic art, in the myths of continents separated by oceans. Its persistence suggests that the Ubaid and early Sumerian cultures may have carried symbolic traditions far older than their material remains. A similar pattern emerges when examining the earliest musical instruments from Mesopotamia. Harps, lyres, and flutes appear early and fully formed, with no obvious prototypes. These instruments require a level of acoustic understanding that usually develops gradually. Yet here again, the earliest examples look strangely confident, as though modeled on earlier designs. Some scholars propose that musical tradition, like astronomical knowledge, was preserved through memory, ritual, or oral transmission. But if so, what older musical culture did these early Mesopotamians inherit from? What ties all of these artifacts together? The figurines, the metallurgical anomalies, the symbolic motifs, the early instruments, is that they feel like fragments. Pieces from a puzzle whose larger image is eroded. It is this fragmentation that gives them their sense of displacement. They do not contradict history, they complicate it. They suggest a cultural inheritance scattered by floods, migrations, and the slow grind of time. They hint at traditions that were older than the settlements that later adopted them, carried across generations like the remnants of a vanished world. And so, the strange artifacts of early Mesopotamia serve not as evidence of a lost civilization, but as echoes. Echoes of knowledge that survived in unexpected forms, embedded in objects whose makers may not have fully understood the origins of their craft. If the Sumerians truly inherited fragments from a pre-flood age, then the anomalies in their artifacts may be the only material hints left of that earlier world, hints that remain silent but persistent, asking quietly, if these are only the fragments that endured, what might the complete heritage of that forgotten era have looked like before the waters erased it? There is a certain tremor in the ancient texts whenever they speak of the survivors, not the ordinary people who rebuilt villages from mud and reed, but the ones described as different, set apart, bearing knowledge that did not match the simplicity of the world that emerged after the catastrophe. The Sumerians, like many early civilizations, preserved strange references to these figures, individuals or groups who arrived after the flood with memories of arts, laws, rituals, and cosmic order. They appear in myths as sages, in king lists as ancestral rulers, in epics as wanderers guided by forgotten wisdom. And the more one traces their presence, the more another question quietly rises. Who were they, really? And why do they appear in so many traditions, separated by continents yet carrying the same unmistakable imprint of origin? The Sumerian Karlu, the seven sages, are described as beings of extraordinary wisdom, emerging after the flood to restore the foundations of civilization. They teach agriculture, measurement, writing, temple design, cosmology. Their descriptions blur the line between human and something other. Some texts depict them as fish-cloaked figures emerging from the waters. Others emphasize their role as intermediaries between worlds. While scholars often interpret these motifs symbolically, their consistent association with pre-flood knowledge raises a subtle tension. If the sages represent memory carriers from an earlier era, then their prominence suggests that the survivors of the antediluvian world were not culturally uniform. Some carried fragments of advanced tradition, while others retained only rudimentary skills. This idea is not unique to Sumer. In Egypt, early dynastic traditions speak of followers of Horus, figures who arrived in the Nile Valley with superior knowledge of agriculture, surveying, and temple architecture. In India, the post-deluge world is restored by sages who recall the old cosmic law, the rishis, whose genealogies trace back to an age before the flood of Manu. In Mesoamerican accounts, figures like Quetzalcoatl or Viracocha bring the knowledge of mathematics, writing, and civil order after a world-ending cataclysm. Even Greek myth describes the repeopling of the world after the flood of Deucalion, guided by remnants of earlier divine instruction. These stories, while separated by immense distances, share a haunting consistency. Somewhere in the memory of nearly every ancient civilization is the sense that a small number of individuals inherited the past, while the majority inherited only survival. What makes this pattern particularly striking in the Sumerian context is the way early dynasties emphasize lineage. Royal inscriptions repeatedly highlight descent from specific ancestral lines, as though legitimacy came not from conquest or territory, but from continuity with an older world. The earliest kings after the flood, those of the first dynasty of Kish, claim authority based on a divine appointment that echoes the pre-flood era. The genealogies often link them not to the common people rebuilding the land, but to a more elusive heritage. While these claims are often framed in symbolic language, they reveal an underlying cultural anxiety. Kingship needed to be anchored in something older than the fragile present. The genealogical transitions in the king list amplify this anxiety. Before the flood, reigns are impossibly long, suggesting a different relationship to time and authority. After the flood, these reigns collapse into human-scaled decades and centuries. But what is often overlooked is how abruptly authority shifts between cities after the flood. First to Kish, then to Uruk, then Ur, then Awan. The rapid relocation of kingship suggests instability, a world searching for continuity that no longer exists. This instability raises another question. Did different groups of survivors carry different fragments of the pre-flood world, fragments that competed or interwove during the rebuilding process? The archaeological record offers hints but not answers. Early dynastic burials show striking disparities in wealth, technology, and ritual complexity. Some graves contain sophisticated metalwork, imported materials, and symbols of authority that appear suddenly, without clear developmental pathways. Others from the same period are simple, almost austere, as though belonging to populations with different histories. This disparity may reflect early stratification, but it may also indicate the merging of groups with unequal access to inherited knowledge. Linguistic evidence adds another layer. Sumerian is a language isolate. It has no known relatives. Some scholars propose that it was the language of an earlier population displaced by later arrivals. Others suggest it may have belonged to a group of survivors whose homeland lies beneath the Persian Gulf, submerged after the Ice Age. If this is true, then the Sumerians themselves may represent a remnant community, carrying a lineage older than the lands they later inhabited. The bloodline question gains further weight when one considers the way early myths describe the transmission of knowledge. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim, the survivor of the flood, is depicted as possessing extraordinary longevity and wisdom, granted by divine beings. Gilgamesh seeks him out not for material instruction, but for access to the knowledge of mortality and renewal. The encounter reflects an older cultural intuition. Some individuals retained secrets from the previous age, secrets inaccessible to the newly formed societies of the post-flood world. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of this question lies in the silence of ordinary people. The earliest tablets offer detailed records of transactions, laws, and temple activities, but they do not speak of how common people understood their place in a world built upon the ruins of another. They leave no trace of their fears, their confusion, their awareness of the discontinuity. Only kings and sages speak in the texts, those whose lineage connected them, however distantly, to the world before. This absence creates a strange impression, a world in which memory was unevenly distributed. Some individuals carried lineages that bridged the catastrophe. Others were merely descendants of those who survived by chance. The sages in Sumerian tradition, semi-divine, semi-human, may symbolize this divide. They represent those who bore the burden of remembering. The question that emerges from this is not one of supernatural ancestry but of cultural inheritance. If a small group preserved fragments of pre-flood knowledge, whether astronomical, architectural, or symbolic, then the birth of civilization becomes not a sudden invention but a convergence, a merging of survivors who held different pieces of an older whole. The deeper one looks, the more the bloodline question becomes a metaphor for continuity. What survives when a world ends? What fragments of memory pass through the narrowing bottleneck of catastrophe? And if the earliest kings and sages were inheritors of something older, then what exactly did they guard? And how much of it has been lost beyond recovery? If the foundations of civilization were carried by only a few, then how many more of the ancient world's stories remain buried in the silence of forgotten bloodlines, waiting to be uncovered in the fragile spaces between myth and memory? There is a moment in the archaeological record, a narrow slice of time barely perceptible on the scale of human evolution, where everything changes with unsettling speed. Mud brick villages become cities, simple tools transform into alloys, oral memory crystallizes into writing, astronomy, law, architecture, sacred ritual, and mathematics appear not as hesitant experiments, but as systems already possessing internal logic. It is as if human civilization, stumbling through millennia of slow development, suddenly stood upright, cleared its throat, and spoke in full sentences. This abruptness has long puzzled scholars, yet the more one studies it, the harder it becomes to ignore the sense of a reset, a reconstruction rather than a beginning. In Mesopotamia, this transformation is most visible in the Urarka explosion around the 4th millennium BCE. Urban centers ballooned, monumental temples rose from the landscape, administrative tablets multiplied, trade networks extended across vast distances. But beneath this flourishing lies a quiet contradiction. The foundations supporting it seem older than the cities themselves. The earliest writing appears too complete, the first law codes too structured, the first standardized weights too consistent. It is as though the people of the New Age were not inventing these systems but reviving them from fragments, guided by ancestral memories that outlived the catastrophe. This contradiction becomes more pronounced when one examines the period immediately preceding the emergence of cities. Across the Near East, the archaeological layers show signs of interruption. Settlements abandoned, pottery styles discontinuing abruptly, subsistence patterns shifting without smooth transition. Climate data indicates sudden aridification and river migration. Some regions experience depopulation. Others saw localized fire destruction followed by long gaps of silence. These breaks suggest that the rise of civilization was not a natural continuation of earlier cultural development, but a response to profound instability. Something disrupted the long arc of human settlement, and in the aftermath, survivors organized themselves with unprecedented intensity, as though rebuilding a world they vaguely remembered but had not fully inherited. The clearest evidence of this reset lies in the monumental architecture of early Mesopotamia. The earliest temples in Uruk, Eridu, and Telukaya do not look experimental. They are geometric, meticulously aligned, and constructed according to plans that suggest symbolic or astronomical significance. That builders understood proportional ratios and ritual pathways. They carved standardized symbols into clay. They oriented the structures toward the heavens. All of this implies not invention, but preservation, the continuation of a tradition older than the cities themselves. Yet the paradox remains, if these traditions were inherited, where are their earlier forms? Why do the layers beneath these cities show simpler structures, less organized communities, and fewer traces of complex knowledge? The answer may lie in the flood layers and the settlement gaps that punctuate the late Neolithic and early Chalcolithic periods. If catastrophic events, whether climatic, geological, or hydrological alike, fragmented earlier societies, then much of their material culture would have been lost. Survivors would have carried memories and rituals forward, but the physical evidence of the earlier world would lie drowned under silt, dispersed in ruins, or scattered among displaced populations. This interpretation aligns with the strangest symmetry of early writing. The first cuneiform is not a crude attempt at communication. It is an organizational tool used to manage a society already dependent on large-scale coordination. It appears in temple complexes, not in isolated households. It emerges alongside standardized tools, regulated trade, and centralized storage. Writing, therefore, was not the catalyst of civilization. It was the scaffold built to support an already complex social structure. Such complexity suggests that the roots of civilization extend deeper than the archaeological record can currently trace. Another piece of the puzzle lies in the sophistication of early mathematics. Base 60 notation, geometric reasoning, and early algebraic thinking appear too suddenly and too coherently. These systems were not improvised. They resemble the remnants of a long tradition adapted into a new cultural form. If the flood or other catastrophes disrupted earlier civilizations, then the mathematics recorded on clay tablets may represent only the portion that survived. A salvage operation executed by scribes determined to restore order in a world shaken by upheaval. The same pattern emerges in early law codes. The Code of Ur-Nammu, predating Hammurabi by centuries, displays a sense of social organization that feels mature, not experimental. It reflects an understanding of human conflict, property rights, responsibility, and restitution that must have developed over long periods. It is difficult to believe that such sophistication arose suddenly in the early Bronze Age without antecedents. More likely, it represents the continuation of legal traditions transmitted orally, or through symbolic customs long before the earliest tablets were written. After the flood, kingship descended again, according to the Sumerian king list. But this descent does not feel like a divine event. It feels administrative. Kingship had been lost. It needed to be re-established. The phrase evokes an image of authority being retrieved from the ruins, restored to a world in need of structure. This implies that the survivors of the flood, or whatever event the legend compresses, were actively reconstructing social memory. One sees signs of this reconstruction in the early dynastic period. City-states competed not only for territory, but for legitimacy. Each claimed ancient roots, divine sanction, ancestral wisdom. The competition suggests insecurity, a fragmented world trying to reassemble itself. Myths were written to define identity. Rituals were standardized to unify communities. Writing was expanded to preserve what remained. The rapid development of civilization may therefore reflect a collective cultural urgency, the need to rebuild what had been lost before memory faded completely. This urgency is also visible in the sudden appearance of urban planning. Streets arranged in grids, water channels directed with engineering foresight, temples elevated on artificial mounds. These features reflect intentional design. They also echo patterns seen in much older sites like Set el Hoyuk, or the enigmatic settlements beneath the Black Sea and Persian Gulf, now lost to rising waters. The resemblance is not direct, but the conceptual thread suggests that the people who built the first cities of Mesopotamia were drawing from ideas embedded deep in human memory. What makes this reset particularly striking is how quickly complexity faded when later civilizations collapsed. When the Akkadian Empire fell, literacy withered, monumental architecture declined, and administrative systems fractured. Unlike the explosion that preceded it, this decline feels natural, gradual, comprehensible. It is only the rise of civilization that feels unnaturally fast. Too fast. If the world that came before the flood had been more complex than commonly believed, then the emergence of civilization after the flood would make more sense. The survivors would not have been inventing everything from scratch. They would have been rebuilding, assembling fragments of architecture, ritual, lore, and astronomy, passed down from a world erased by catastrophe. The question is no longer whether civilization rose abruptly, but why it rose the way it did, as though remembering rather than discovering. And if the early cities of Mesopotamia were indeed built on the fading memory of an earlier world, then what lies beneath the forgotten layers of silt, waiting for excavation, might not only challenge our timelines, but reveal the faint outlines of a deeper human story. If civilization was a reboot, then how much of the original program still sleeps in the unexcavated ruins of the world before the waters came? There is a moment in the archaeological record, a narrow slice of time barely perceptible on the scale of human evolution, where everything changes with unsettling speed. Mud brick villages become cities. Simple tools transform into alloys. Oral memory crystallizes into writing. Astronomy, law, architecture, sacred ritual, and mathematics appear not as hesitant experiments, but as systems already possessing internal logic. It is as if human civilization, stumbling through millennia of slow development, suddenly stood upright, cleared its throat, and spoke in full sentences. This abruptness has long puzzled scholars, yet the more one studies it, the harder it becomes to ignore the sense of a reset, a reconstruction rather than a beginning. In Mesopotamia, this transformation is most visible in the Uruk explosion around the 4th millennium BCE. Urban centers ballooned. Monumental temples rose from the landscape. Administrative tablets multiplied. Trade networks extended across vast distances. But beneath this flourishing lies a quiet contradiction. The foundations supporting it seem older than the cities themselves. The earliest writing appears too complete. The first law codes too structured. The first standardized weights too consistent. It is as though the people of the New Age were not inventing these systems, but reviving them from fragments, guided by ancestral memories that outlived the catastrophe. This contradiction becomes more pronounced when one examines the period immediately preceding the emergence of cities. Across the Near East, the archaeological layers show signs of interruption. Settlements abandoned, pottery styles discontinuing abruptly, subsistent patterns shifting without smooth transition. Climate data indicates sudden aridification and river migration. Some regions experience depopulation. Others saw localized fire destruction followed by long gaps of silence. These breaks suggest that the rise of civilization was not a natural continuation of earlier cultural development, but a response to profound instability. Something disrupted the long arc of human settlement, and in the aftermath, survivors organized themselves with unprecedented intensity, as they're rebuilding a world they vaguely remembered but did not fully inherited. The clearest evidence of this reset lies in the monumental architecture of early Mesopotamia. The earliest temples in Uruk, Eridu, and Telukaya do not look experimental. They're geometric, meticulously aligned, and constructed according to plans that suggest symbolic or astronomical significance. The builders understood proportional ratios and ritual pathways. They carved standardized symbols into clay. They oriented the structures toward the heavens. All of this implies not invention, but preservation, continuation of a tradition older than the cities themselves. Yet the paradox remains: if these traditions were inherited, where are their earlier forms? Why did the layers beneath these cities show simpler structures, less organized communities, and fewer traces of complex knowledge? The answer may lie in the flood layers and the settlement gaps that punctuate the late Neolithic and early Chalcolithic periods. If catastrophic events, whether climatic, geological, or hydrological, fragmented earlier societies, then much of their material culture would have been lost. Survivors would have carried memories and rituals forward, but the physical evidence of the earlier world would lie drowned under silt, dispersed in ruins, or scattered among displaced populations. This interpretation aligns with the strange asymmetry of early writing. The first cuneiform is not a crude attempt at communication. It is an organizational tool used to manage a society already dependent on large-scale coordination. It appears in temple complexes, not in isolated households. It emerges alongside standardized tools, regulated trade, and centralized storage. Writing, therefore, was not the catalyst of civilization. It was the scaffold built to support an already complex social structure. Such complexity suggests that the roots of civilization extend deeper than the archaeological record can currently trace. Another piece of the puzzle lies in the sophistication of early mathematics. Base 60 notation, geometric reasoning, and early algebraic thinking appear too suddenly and too coherently. These systems were not improvised. They resemble the remnants of a long tradition adapted into a new cultural form. If the flood or other catastrophes disrupted earlier civilizations, then the mathematics recorded on clay tablets may represent only the portion that survived. A salvage operation executed by scribes determined to restore order in a world shaken by upheaval. The same pattern emerges in early law codes. The Code of Ur-Nammu, predating Hammurabi by centuries, displays a sense of social organization that feels mature, not experimental. It reflects an understanding of human conflict, property rights, responsibility, and restitution that must have developed over long periods. It is difficult to believe that such sophistication arose suddenly in the early Bronze Age without antecedents. More likely, it represents the continuation of legal traditions transmitted orally, or through symbolic customs long before the earliest tablets were written. After the flood, kingship descended again, according to the Sumerian king list. But this descent does not feel like a divine event, it feels administrative. Kingship had been lost, it needed to be re-established. The phrase evokes an image of authority being retrieved from the ruins, restored to a world in need of structure. This implies that the survivors of the flood, or whatever event the legend compresses, were actively reconstructing social memory. One sees signs of this reconstruction in the early dynastic period. City-states competed not only for territory, but for legitimacy. Each claimed ancient roots, divine sanction, ancestral wisdom. The competition suggests insecurity, a fragmented world trying to reassemble itself. Myths were written to define identity. Rituals were standardized to unify communities. Writing was expanded to preserve what remained. The rapid development of civilization may therefore reflect a collective cultural urgency, the need to rebuild what had been lost before memory faded completely. This urgency is also visible in the sudden appearance of urban planning. Streets arranged in grids, water channels directed with engineering foresight, temples elevated on artificial mounds. These features reflect intentional design. They also echo patterns seen in much older sites like Kut el Huyuk, or the enigmatic settlements beneath the Black Sea and Persian Gulf, now lost to rising waters. The resemblance is not direct, but the conceptual thread suggests that the people who built the first cities of Mesopotamia were drawing from ideas embedded deep in human memory. What makes this reset particularly striking is how quickly complexity faded when later civilizations collapsed. When the Akkadian Empire fell, literacy withered, monumental architecture declined, and administrative systems fractured. Unlike the explosion that preceded it, this decline feels natural, gradual, comprehensible. It is only the rise of civilization that feels unnaturally fast, too fast. If the world that came before the flood had been more complex than commonly believed, then the emergence of civilization after the flood would make more sense. The survivors would not have been inventing everything from scratch. They would have been rebuilding, assembling fragments of architecture, ritual, lore, and astronomy, passed down from a world erased by catastrophe. The question is no longer whether civilization rose abruptly, but why it rose the way it did, as though remembering rather than discovering. And if the early cities of Mesopotamia were indeed built on the fading memory of an earlier world, then what lies beneath the forgotten layers of silt, waiting for excavation, might not only challenge our timelines but reveal the faint outlines of a deeper human story. If civilization was a reboot, then how much of the original program still sleeps in the unexcavated ruins of the world before the waters came? There is a peculiar stillness that hangs over the oldest layers of Mesopotamia, a stillness so complete that even the archaeological trenches seem hesitant to disturb it. The deeper excavators dig, the closer they come to a point where history itself begins to dissolve. Potsherds thin out, architecture loses clarity, cultural signatures fade. It is as though there exists a threshold, a quiet boundary, beyond which the past refuses to speak. This silence is not emptiness. It is the presence of something that once was but no longer wishes to be seen. And in this stillness one begins to sense the shadow of the world before the flood, buried under layers of earth, memory, and time. In most Mesopotamian sites, The earliest excavated levels reveal densely packed remains of Uruk, Ubaid, or Jemdet Narasa settlements. Houses pressed against each other, hearths, tools, broken figurines, evidence of life. But beneath these layers lies something different, a zone of ambiguity where cultural patterns fragment, where settlement becomes sparse, where the ground carries signs of habitation but not of continuity. Archaeologists call these transitional layers pre-urban horizons, though the term feels insufficient. They represent not a beginning but an interruption. At Eridu, the lowest levels of the Temple Mound reveal foundations that grow progressively simpler and more austere as one descends, until suddenly, nothing. A sterile layer of sand and silt separates the earliest human structures from the natural sediments below. This is expected in archaeological terms, but what troubles scholars is not the natural layer, but its thickness and uniformity. It is too clean, too consistent, as if something swept across the region and erased whatever stood there, leaving a fresh slate for the next world to begin. A similar pattern appears at Uruk. Beneath the proto-writing levels, beneath the early temples, beneath even the oldest signs of organized settlement, lies a stretch of ground that offers little more than scattered hearths and faint traces of occupation. No elaborate figurines, no sophisticated pottery, no monumental architecture. Yet the sudden leap from these faint traces to the fully realized urbanism above feels unnatural. Something is missing, not by chance but by absence. The flood layers that appear in certain sites offer one explanation, but they do not tell the whole story. While Shuruppak, Kish, and a handful of other cities display clear flood deposits around 2900 BCE, the deeper silences in the archaeological record date to far earlier periods, well before the known historical flood. These older interruptions suggest cycles of destruction and renewal that preceded the one immortalized in the Sumerian tablets. If the flood of Ziusudra was the final catastrophe remembered, it may have been simply the last in a long sequence. Outside Mesopotamia, one finds similar silences. In the Levant, early Neolithic settlements abruptly end. Some are abandoned without signs of struggle, famine, or conflict. Others appear to have suffered environmental collapse. In Iran, early pottery traditions vanish without clear descent. In Anatolia, the monumental carvings of Göbekli Tepe were deliberately buried beneath tons of soil, as if closing the final chapter of a world that no longer wished to continue. These patterns are subtle, but their synchronicity suggests that something vast and disruptive shaped the landscape of early civilization. But perhaps the most unsettling silence is not geological or architectural, but textual. When writing finally emerges in the late 4th millennium BCE, it speaks with the voice of a world already rebuilt. The earliest tablets contain no myths of origins, no accounts of earlier ages, no explanations for the sudden rise of the cities. They begin in the middle of things: temple inventories, grain rations, lists of professions. It is only centuries later that scribes begin to write myths. And when they do, the world before the flood is described in clipped, almost reluctant detail. No elaborate stories, no elaborate descriptions, just names, reign lengths, and the assertion that then the flood swept over. The brevity feels intentional, as if the scribes themselves sensed the fragility of the memory and dared not embellish what little remained. This textual silence mirrors the archaeological one. Both hint at a rupture that severed the continuity of memory. Some scholars suggest that oral tradition filled the gap, that the earliest stories passed mouth to ear for generations simply did not survive intact. Yet this explanation feels insufficient. Oral tradition thrives in continuity, in stable societies, in communities that pass down rituals and stories without interruption. But the earliest layers of Mesopotamian settlement do not show continuity. They show breaks, upheavals, and migrations. In such conditions, memory shatters. People carry fragments, not narratives. And the stories that reach later scribes, they reflect only the faint outlines of what their ancestors once knew. The image of a world forgotten is not unique to Mesopotamia. In Greece, Hesiod speaks of earlier ages, the Golden Age, the Silver Age, lost to time. In India, the cycles of yugas describe worlds that collapse and restart. In Egypt, the followers of Horus are remembered as rulers from an epoch too distant to reconstruct. Everywhere one looks, ancient cultures gesture toward an older world, but none describe it in detail. The silence is universal, as if humanity collectively agreed not to touch the memories buried beneath the flood. One interpretation is that the silence reflects trauma. Catastrophic events can erase not only cities but meaning. Survivors rebuild but do not necessarily understand what came before. Over generations, the stories fade into abstract myth. Another interpretation is that the world before the flood was so different from the world after that its memory could not be expressed in familiar terms. Perhaps its language was different, its customs alien, its symbols incompatible with the societies that came after. If so, then the silence is not an absence, but a boundary, a recognition that the past before the flood was truly another world. The archaeological silences grow most profound in regions now submerged. Beneath the Persian Gulf lies a shelf that was once dry land, potentially home to early human settlements, whose remains are inaccessible beneath layers of silt. Along the Indian coast, underwater ruins suggest habitation before sea levels rose. Across Southeast Asia, entire shelf regions disappeared between 12,000 and 7,000 years ago. If the earliest civilizations originated along these coastal plains, their destruction by rising waters would explain the suddenness of later urban development and the absence of earlier deeper layers. And so the silence of the ruins becomes more than an archaeological curiosity. It becomes the shadow of a world that ended before writing could capture it. The Sumerians, in their terse mention of antediluvian cities, may have recorded not a mythical era but the faint memory of settlements now lost beneath water and time. If these older worlds lie hidden under sediments and seas, if their stories survive only in fragmented myths and the abruptness of early civilization, then what might emerge if the silence were ever broken? If some buried layer, untouched for millennia, revealed a glimpse of the world that existed before the Great Flood? There is a faint but persistent tension in the ancient texts whenever they drift toward subjects that feel too old, too fragile, or too dangerous to articulate. It is as though the earliest scribes were aware that some memories were not meant to be handled openly. Certain stories are written only in fragments. Certain tablets vanish from the archaeological record as if deliberately removed. Certain myths appear heavily edited, their edges softened, their meanings obscured, and somewhere within these evasions lies the sense that knowledge from the world before the flood was not merely forgotten. It may have been withheld, suppressed, or deemed too perilous for ordinary understanding. In Mesopotamia, this tension surfaces most clearly in the figure of Enki, the god of wisdom. Enki is the one who defies divine decree to save humanity from the flood, by warning Ziusudra of the impending catastrophe. In some versions of the story, he speaks through a reed hut so that the other gods cannot hear his message. Why such secrecy? Why must the preservation of a knowledge be hidden? Enki's role feels less like divine rebellion, and more like the preservation of something older, a memory carried forward despite the efforts of others to erase it. The Akkadian Atrahasis epic reinforces this theme. The gods grow displeased with humanity's noise, a metaphor often interpreted as overpopulation or disruption of cosmic order. But what is striking is not the reason for the flood but the decision to destroy knowledge along with people. When Enki warns Atrahasis, He instructs him not only to build a vessel but to preserve the wisdom of the craftsman, the teachings of the priests, and the records of the people. The implication is unmistakable. Knowledge was threatened with extinction, and not by accident. Someone, or something, sought to create a rupture between the world before the flood and the world after. This motif repeats across cultures. In Egypt, priestly traditions guarded older knowledge that was not to be spoken to the uninitiated. Certain temple inscriptions reference scrolls of the ancients, locked away in sanctuaries. In India, the Vedas speak of teachings reserved for specific castes, transmitted orally but forbidden to others. In Greece, Pythagorean teachings were secret, shared only with initiates and tightly controlled. These examples come from later civilizations, but they echo an older instinct. Some knowledge carries immense power, and power invites control. In Mesopotamia itself, evidence of knowledge restriction appears in the remnants of libraries. The library of Ashurbanipal contained classified sections. Tablets allowed only for priests, others forbidden to the uninitiated. Some of these tablets reference earlier texts now lost. Others mention rituals from before the flood, preserved through careful copying. The line between preservation and suppression is thin. If scribes preserved these texts for thousands of years, why did so many others vanish? Were they lost simply through time, or were some deliberately withheld? The destruction of texts is not uncommon in human history. Fires, wars, and neglect have erased countless records. Yet the pattern in Mesopotamia feels selective. The earliest administrative tablets survive in abundance, but mythological tablets from similar periods are rare. King lists appear in multiple copies, but detailed accounts of pre-flood life do not. It is as if the post-flood world prioritized order, grain, labor, trade, accounting, while letting memories of the past slip away, or perhaps be buried intentionally under the weight of new institutions. This selective remembering parallels the rise of temple bureaucracies. Early priesthoods controlled writing, astronomy, legal systems, and rituals. They were the gatekeepers of knowledge, deciding what was recorded and what was forgotten. In such systems, memory becomes power, and power accumulates around what is kept secret. It is possible that some knowledge inherited from the pre-flood world was preserved only for the elite, encoded in rituals or symbolic language inaccessible to ordinary people. Some researchers argue that myths of forbidden knowledge reflect anxieties about technological or societal changes, fears that certain tools or ideas could disrupt social harmony. Others see them as metaphors for spiritual transformation. Yet the recurrence of the motif across distant cultures suggests something deeper. If the earliest civilizations did inherit fragments of knowledge from the world before the flood, those fragments may have been unstable, dangerous, or misunderstood. The custodians of these traditions may have chosen to limit access, believing the world was not ready for what remained of the old age. Archaeology provides intriguing hints. In temples at Eridu, some of the earliest ritual structures appear deliberately sealed by later builders. Foundations are preserved, not dismantled. Offerings are placed over old altars, as though venerating a forgotten practice. At the same time, certain symbols vanish from artistic repertoires after specific turning points, replaced by new motifs more aligned with emerging systems of authority. Symbolic shifts like these often signal changes in ideological control, eras in which old knowledge is reinterpreted, suppressed, or rebranded for new cultural contexts. The deliberate burial of Göbekli Tepe offers another example of forgotten or hidden knowledge. The decision to cover the site undertaken by the people who built it suggests a ritual closing not merely of a sanctuary but of an entire world view. If such a monumental center could be intentionally buried, then it is not unthinkable that later civilizations might have similarly hidden or discarded knowledge that no longer fit within the image of the reconstructed world. In Mesopotamian traditions, the idea of restricted knowledge becomes explicit in the myth of Adarpa. The sage who was granted wisdom but denied immortality. The gods give him insight into the heavenly order, but forbid him the knowledge of eternal life. The myth reflects a worldview in which certain truths are not meant for humanity, or at least not for all of humanity. This restriction hints at a larger anxiety, the boundary between what was preserved from the world before the flood and what was intentionally withheld. Even the Sumerian king list reflects this theme. Its antediluvian section is spare, factual, and opaque, as though presenting only the skeleton of a memory while leaving the body of the story hidden. It names cities and kings but gives no details. It is a list, not narrative. This feels less like ignorance and more like omission, a deliberate narrowing of the window into the past. The question that lingers beneath all of this is not whether ancient civilizations possessed forbidden knowledge, but why they believed some knowledge should be restricted at all. Was it fear, trauma, reverence? Or did they sense that the world before the flood operated under conditions so different from their own that its truths could not be safely translated into the new era? If fragments of pre-flood knowledge were indeed preserved, in myths, in symbols, in sealed temple rooms, then much of what we now call ancient mystery may not be enigmatic at all. It may simply be the residue of a world whose memory was carefully controlled, shaped by those who survived and those who claimed custodianship over the fragments that remained. If the earliest civilizations filtered the inheritance of the old world, choosing what to preserve and what to conceal, then what crucial truths might still lie hidden, not lost but intentionally buried within the silence of forbidden knowledge? There is something almost unnerving in the way the Sumerian king list presents the world before the flood. Not poetically, not mythically, not with the grandeur one might expect from a civilization trying to glorify its origins. Instead, the text unfolds with an austere and bureaucratic calmness, as if recounting warehouse inventories rather than epochs older than memory. It names 8 kings over 5 cities, assigns them reign lengths in the tens of thousands of years, and then, with chilling indifference, adds a single line. Then the flood swept over. No elaboration, no moral, no drama. The silence between those words feels heavier than the clay they were pressed into. The understated nature of the king list has long complicated modern interpretation. If these were myths, why are they written with the tone of administration? If they are to be symbolic, why is their symbolism so opaque? If literal, how does one reconcile such time spans with human biology? The king list occupies a space between categories, refusing to submit fully to any explanation. And in this ambiguity lies the enduring fascination of the text. It holds clues, but not answers. The first clue lies in the structure itself. The antediluvian section is organized with an almost mechanical precision. Each king is assigned a city. Each city hosts a segment of kingship. Kingship moves in a strict sequence. Eridu, Bad-Tabera, Larak, Sipa, Shurapak. This orderly framework suggests memory, not invention. Myths tend to sprawl, but the king list contracts the world before the flood into a narrow chain of custody. Someone cared enough about this sequence to preserve it exactly. Why? What was so important about the order in which these cities held authority? Archaeology complicates matters further. Eridu is indeed one of the oldest known settlements, but Bad-Tabera's location remains uncertain. Larak is invisible in the archaeological record. Sipa exists but shows no clear evidence of pre-flood occupation. Shurapak bears the flood layer but also reveals earlier disruptions not mentioned in the tablets. The kingless cities resemble shadows cast by a much deeper past. partially preserved and partially erased. It is possible that the names correspond to older settlements now buried beneath shifting rivers or beneath the waters of the Persian Gulf. If so, the king list may contain geographical memory of a landscape that no longer exists. The reign links pose another riddle. Critics often argue that numbers in ancient texts cannot be taken literally. Yet the reigns in the king list do not behave like symbolic numbers. They do not follow simple multipliers or sacred patterns. Some are divisible by 60, others are not. Some echo astronomical cycles, while others do not align with any known system. The irregularity suggests that these numbers originated from a source beyond the scribe's full understanding, perhaps inherited from pre-existing traditions whose original numerical logic had already faded. One theory proposes that the reigns represent dynastic periods rather than individual lifespans. Another suggests they encode astronomical cycles, such as precessional ages or planetary alignments. A third speculates that they reflect a world in which environmental conditions, cosmic radiation, or atmospheric differences may have influenced human longevity. All of these theories stretch the imagination, yet none can be entirely dismissed because the king list refuses to clarify its intent. Its silence makes every interpretation uncertain, but not impossible. The brevity of the antediluvian section is also suspicious. Later sections of the king list include detailed corrections, debates over genealogy, and revised chronologies, yet the earliest part is left untouched, as though the scribes did not dare modify it. They copied it faithfully even when it conflicted with known historical realities. This reference suggests that the pre-flood section was already ancient when the king list was first compiled, a relic of oral tradition or earlier writings now lost. The mention of kingship descending from heaven before the flood and descending again afterward also carries subtle implications. Many dismiss this as mythic language, but the concept of kingship descending may signify an ideological or administrative transfer. Authority, in other words, may have originated from a central cultural source, a pre-flood institution, and been restored after the catastrophe. This interpretation aligns with archaeological evidence of sudden reorganization and renewed urban planning after periods of collapse. Another unanswered clue lies in the list's treatment of continuity. After the flood, kingship is relocated not to Eridu, the first city, but to Kish, a city that gains prominence rapidly in the archaeological record but shows no sign of extreme antiquity. Why Kish? Why not return to the older centers? The shift suggests a break in cultural memory. The survivors who rebuilt civilization may not have been the same cultural group that inhabited the antediluvian cities. They inherited the names but not the places. The king list, therefore, may reflect the memories of a displaced people, preserving the identity of a world that no longer aligned with their geography. Even more curious is the presence of parallel king lists from later periods, some of which include additional pre-flood kings or variations in the sequence. These inconsistencies imply that multiple traditions once existed, each carrying slightly different memories of the earliest age. A standardized version we possess may represent only one strand of a broader tapestry of recollection. What the king list does not say is as important as what it does. It does not describe the culture, language, or technologies of the pre-flood world. It does not explain why cities existed before agriculture was fully established, or why these 5 cities alone held kingship. It does not record how the flood changed the landscape or why the survivors rebuilt civilization differently afterward. These omissions hint at a lost narrative, a story that was known but deemed either unnecessary, incomprehensible, or forbidden to record. The king list's austerity invites speculation precisely because it does not attempt to justify itself. It offers a chronology from a world no longer accessible, preserved in a form that suggests both reverence and incompleteness. It is a list, not a story. Perhaps because the story was already too fractured to tell. Some researchers believe the king list encodes geological or astronomical cycles. Others argue for symbolic kingship. Still others see in it the faint memory of real leaders from ancient forgotten settlements. But all agree on one point. The king list is an anomaly. It is older in tone than the writing that preserves it, older in imagination than the cities that copied it, older perhaps than the world that replaced the one swept away by the flood. If the king list is truly a doorway into the pre-flood world, then it stands ajar, revealing only a sliver of a landscape now lost to water and time. And if the earliest kings it names were not myths but echoes, then what fuller histories might lie just beyond our reach, waiting in the stories that the tablets never dared to write? There is a strange softness that settles over the mind when one imagines the world before the flood. Not the world of kings and temples, but the landscapes themselves, erased so thoroughly that even their shadows feel uncertain. Scholars often speak of this era as though it existed only in myth, yet the earth carries its memory everywhere, along drowned coastlines beneath layers of silt, in the quiet gaps that haunt the archaeological record. These absences are not empty. They are the imprint of a world that ended in ways humanity is not fully remembered. And in this final arc of the journey through the Sumerian texts, the question becomes not whether a pre-flood world existed, but how much of it still lies concealed, just beneath the waterline of our understanding. To grasp this hidden memory, one has to look where the land meets the sea, to the submerged plains that once connected continents. During the last ice age, the Persian Gulf Basin was an immense valley, a fertile corridor fed by rivers long since swallowed by rising seas. If early human communities lived there, if they built settlements or early sanctuaries, their remains would now lie beneath dozens of meters of water and sediment. This possibility has long lingered at the edge of academic discussion, rarely pursued, partly because underwater archaeology in the Gulf is difficult, and partly because acknowledging it would shift the foundation of early Mesopotamian history. Yet, if the first cities or sacred sites of humanity once stood on that submerged shelf, their disappearance would explain why the earliest written traditions speak of antediluvian cities that leave almost no trace. Even on land, the memory of those earlier worlds appears fragmented. Excavations throughout Iraq and Iran show layers of settlement that vanish abruptly, followed by periods of silence before new cultures appear. Such breaks do not resemble smooth cultural evolution. They resemble interruption, destruction, and refounding. The deeper the excavators dig, the more ancient these cycles appear. The Ubaid transitions, the Uruk expansions, the mysterious late Neolithic dispersals, these patterns suggest that the flood remembered in Sumerian tradition was not an isolated event but part of a longer sequence of upheavals stretching back to the end of the Pleistocene. The Sumerian scribes did not elaborate on these earlier worlds. They spoke of them only in the faintest outline, a handful of cities, a lineage of kings, and then silence. Perhaps they did not understand the full story themselves. Perhaps the memories they inherited had already become so fragmented that only the structural core remained, or perhaps certain details were intentionally withheld, preserved only for the initiated. Whatever the reason, the textural silence around the pre-flood world mirrors the geological silence in the ruins beneath our feet. The idea that the flood wiped out not just people, but knowledge resonates across multiple civilizations. Greek historians speak of cycles in which humanity rises, forgets, and rises again. Indian texts describe yugas, each ending in catastrophe, with the survivors inheriting only fragments of cosmic truth. Egyptian priests told Solon that their own records preserved only faint echoes of earlier destructions, and that humanity repeatedly lost the memory of its earlier ages. These claims are often treated as allegory, but the consistency across continents suggests something more profound, that the ancient world may have recognized patterns of collapse long before archaeology existed. If the Sumerian scribes were inheritors of fragmented memory, then the world they described before the flood was not merely ancient but layered, shaped by successive resets. Each catastrophe would have thinned the record further. By the time writing emerged, the scribes were already living in a world rebuilt from the fragments of earlier epochs. Their tablets preserve only the last faint glimmer of a deeper lineage. This might explain why early Sumerian culture feels so strangely mature for its archaeological horizon. Writing appears fully formed. Temple architecture displays symbolic logic. Administrative systems show advanced planning. The society seems to awaken already, knowing things it should have taken centuries to learn. Instead of a steady evolution from simple to complex, the Sumerian world reads like a resumption, the reactivation of knowledge carried through memory, myth, and lineage. It is this sense of reactivation that gives the early chapters of human history their uncanny resonance, as though civilization were remembering rather than inventing itself. Yet the memory is incomplete. It is fractured, hazy, marked by absences. And those absences are where the imagination begins to drift, toward the submerged landscapes, the buried river valleys, the eroded plains, the lost coastlines. If settlements existed there, if knowledge was preserved in those vanished places, then our current understanding of early civilization is only a partial frame. The Sumerians may have been the first to write, but they may not have been the first to know. This possibility becomes especially haunting when one considers the ritual and symbolic motifs found in the earliest Mesopotamian temples. Fish-cloaked sages emerging from the waters, serpentine guardians of the deep, cosmic diagrams carved onto clay. These images do not feel like inventions of a people experiencing urbanization for the first time. They feel like echoes, imperfect recollections of something older, something tied to water, to the sea, to worlds that now lie drowned beyond recovery. Even the idea of kingship descending from heaven may reflect an older truth repackaged in mythic language. The restoration of a pre-existing order after a period of chaos, the sudden establishment of kingship, its structured movement among cities, and its careful preservation through lists and rituals hints at a tradition older than the post-flood world. A tradition that survived not through continuity, but through deliberate transmission, the kind of transmission one might expect from a people emerging from catastrophe, trying to salvage the last fragments of what came before. If so, then the Sumerian king list is not a literal record, nor merely symbolic. It is a bridge, a compressed memory spanning the abyss between epochs. It names what survived, not what existed. It presents the bones of a story whose flesh was washed away. In this sense, the memory beneath the waterline is not just physical, it is psychological. It is the memory that humanity carries in myth, in ritual, in intuition. The feeling that something vital was lost. The suspicion that our beginnings were not as simple as they appear. The quiet echo of worlds erased. And so, the journey through the Sumerian records ends not with a revelation, but with a horizon. The edge where known history meets the sea. Beyond that horizon lies a world that has not yet been recovered, a world whose ruins sleep beneath sediment and salt. One can almost sense it, like a city glimpsed through mist, waiting for the tide of time to recede. If the truth about the world before the Great Flood is still hidden somewhere, in drowned valleys, in buried temples, in the silence of the oldest layers, then what else might surface if we learn to read the earth not only for what it remembers, but also for what it has tried, again and again, to forget?